The money was on the back seat of the car on a Tuesday morning in October, a single folded bill, placed there with the specific deliberateness of someone who needed it to appear accidental. $400. 4 crisp hundreds folded once, tucked into the crease between the seat cushion and the backrest, visible enough to notice but not so conspicuous that it looked planted. Vincent Hale had put it there himself at 6:30 that morning, before Marcus arrived to take the car out of the garage. He had done this with the practiced care of a man who understood that the staging of a test mattered as much as the test itself. Marcus Webb had driven for Vincent Hale for 20 years. He had driven him to the office and to the airport and to his son's school plays and to 3 funerals, each of which Marcus had navigated with a specific and unobtrusive care, knowing the right moment to hold a door and the right moment to simply wait with the engine running, and to the hospital the night Vincent's wife had her stroke, and to the rehabilitation facility for the months after. Arriving each day in time to take Mrs. Hale her preferred coffee from the place on Elm that she had been going to since before the stroke, the coffee that she could no longer drive to herself. A detail he had learned from Mrs. Hale in a brief conversation and had never needed to be reminded of. Marcus had driven Vincent's daughter to her wedding in a car so carefully cleaned that the interior smelled faintly of the product Marcus used on the leather, a smell that Vincent's daughter had mentioned in her toast that evening inexplicably but genuinely, as one of the details she would always remember about that day. Marcus Webb was 58 years old. He was a deliberate man, careful in his movements and economical in his speech. The kind of person whose reliability had become so complete over 20 years that it had stopped being noticed the way reliable things stop being noticed, the way the floor holds you up without your thinking about it. He drove a consistent 8 miles below the posted speed limit, which Vincent had noted and never questioned. He knew every airport terminal and every parking structure and every hotel entrance in the greater Hartford area, and he knew them not from navigation systems, but from the accumulated knowledge of 20 years of paying attention. He was the kind of employee that Vincent Hale had never once had occasion to worry about, which was, Vincent had come to understand only recently, a different thing from truly knowing what kind of person Marcus Webb was. The knowing had become a question for Vincent in the last 6 months, for reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with Vincent himself. Vincent was 67 years old. He had spent 40 years building a regional commercial real estate firm that had made him more money than he had needed and considerably more money than he had expected when he started it. And he had arrived in his mid-60s at the specific kind of retrospective assessment that arrives for men who have made their money and are now trying to figure out what exactly they have made of themselves in the process. He had read, in this period of assessment, more biographies of important men than he had read in the previous 40 years combined. And what had struck him, reading them, was not the success stories, but the stories of betrayal, of men who had surrounded themselves with loyal-seeming people who had been all along loyal only to the proximity of wealth, and had demonstrated this when the wealth or the access to it shifted. Vincent had no specific reason to suspect Marcus of anything, and he wanted to be clear about this in his own mind, repeating it to himself in the way you repeat a thing you are not entirely sure you believe, because he understood that suspecting someone without cause was a form of insult that a man of his resources could easily afford, and that the ease of it was itself a danger, and that Marcus had done nothing to warrant this kind of interrogation after 20 years of the opposite. What he had was not suspicion, but something more like a philosophical question, the kind that arrives at 67 when you start thinking about the shape of your life and the people in it, about which of the relationships surrounding you were genuinely what they appeared to be and which had been all along, a transaction both parties had agreed to call something else. He had considered other ways to learn what he wanted to know. He had thought about talking to Marcus directly, but this felt both unfair and insufficient. Unfair, because it would put Marcus in the position of defending himself against a suspicion he had not earned, and insufficient, because a conversation would only tell Vincent what Marcus was willing to say, which was not the same as what Marcus actually was. He had thought about watching Marcus more closely over time, But 20 years of close proximity had already told him everything that observation could tell him, and still left the question open. The money on the seat was the answer he had arrived at, imperfect and slightly degrading to both of them, which Vincent acknowledged privately and which he had decided was preferable to not knowing. Marcus arrived at the Hale house at 7:15, as he always did, letting himself in through the garage entrance with the code that had not changed in 12 years, a code he had memorized without being asked to memorize it, in the way that people who pay close attention to their work memorize the small practical details that make the work go smoothly, and moving through the garage to the car with the specific ease of someone who has performed the same sequence of actions thousands of times and for whom the space has become an extension of his own familiarity. He opened the driver's side door and settled in and adjusted the mirror, which he always adjusted even though it was always correct when he arrived, a habit Vincent had noticed across 20 years without ever asking about. Then, he turned around and saw the money Vincent was watching through the small window that connected the garage to the house's interior, a window that looked out onto the garage at an angle that gave him a clear view of the back seat and of Marcus's face in the rearview mirror. He had positioned himself there at 7:10, 5 minutes before Marcus was due, and had been standing in the slight chill of the garage-adjacent space watching when Marcus turned and saw the folded bills. Marcus looked at the money for a moment. Vincent watched his face in the mirror. There was no legible calculation there, no visible working out of the situation, which Vincent had expected and had been watching for, the specific quality of a person doing the math on something unexpected. There was only a brief pause, the kind of pause a man makes when he has noticed something he needs to deal with. And then Marcus reached into the back seat and picked up the 4 folded hundreds. Vincent felt something tighten in his chest. He watched Marcus look at the bills in his hand, turning them once. Then Marcus opened the center console and placed the money inside it. He closed the console. He turned back to the front. He adjusted the mirror, which was still correct. He pulled out of the garage. Vincent stood in the space beside the garage for a moment after the car disappeared. He had a specific feeling he could not immediately name, something in the territory between disappointment and the vindication of a worst-case expectation. The money was in the center console. Marcus had put it there. He had not left it on the seat, had not placed it on the dashboard where it would be immediately visible to Vincent, had not called the house to report finding cash in the car. He had put it in the console, which was the action of someone who intended to deal with it later, or perhaps not at all. Vincent arrived at the office 40 minutes later. Having taken a cab because the car was with Marcus running errands for the first part of the day, a cab he had not needed to call because his assistant had already arranged it, one of the many small logistical arrangements that the absence of Marcus automatically required. He sat at his desk and thought about what he had seen. The money in the console, the pause, Marcus's face in the mirror, which had told him nothing in the moment and which he kept returning to now, trying to read something in the retrospective image that had not been there in real time, which was itself, perhaps, the most telling detail, a face that offered nothing to read because there was nothing being performed. He was still thinking about it at 11 when his phone rang. The call was from Marcus. Vincent answered. Marcus said he had found something in the back seat that morning that he wanted to tell Vincent about. Vincent said, "What was it?" Marcus said it was $400 in cash, that he had put it in the center console because he had not wanted it to slide around in the back during the drive, and that he wanted to make sure Vincent knew it was there. He said he was not sure if it was money Vincent had set down and forgotten, or if it had come from somewhere else. But either way, he wanted to make sure it got back to the right person. He said all of this in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, the voice that had been the backdrop of 20 years of drives through the greater Hartford area, the voice that conveyed neither defensiveness nor performance, neither the eagerness of someone hoping to be praised for doing the right thing, nor the studied casualness of someone trying to make less of the situation than it was, simply the voice of a man reporting a straightforward fact to someone he expected to handle it straightforwardly. Vincent held the phone for a moment. He said thank you, that he must have set it down without thinking, that he would get it when Marcus brought the car back at noon. Marcus said he would leave it on the seat so it was easy to find. He said have a good morning and that he would see him at 12, and then he hung up. Vincent set his phone on the desk and looked at the window of his office, which faced east and had a view of the parking structure across the street that he had owned for 11 years and never thought about because it ran itself without requiring his attention. He thought about Marcus Webb. He thought about the center console and the call at 11 and about what the 4 hours between had contained. 4 hours during which Marcus had known the money was in the car and had driven his errands and had called Vincent as soon as it was reasonable to call. Not at 7:15 when he found it, and Vincent would still have been finishing breakfast. But at 11 when the errands were done and the day was settled enough for a phone call. He thought about what he had been looking for and what he had found, which was not what he had expected to find in either direction. He had been prepared for Marcus to keep the money, which would have answered the question he was asking cleanly, if painfully. He had been half prepared for Marcus to call immediately, at 7:15 or 7:30, which would have answered the question too in the other direction, clearly and without complication. What he had gotten instead was $400 in the center console and a phone call at 11. Which was not the dramatic demonstration of loyalty that a lesser man might have constructed for an employer he suspected of watching, and was not the simple taking of an opportunity that a person of lesser character might have defaulted to, but was simply what Marcus apparently always did, which was handle things carefully and without fuss, and in the way that made the most sense given the actual circumstances. He called his personal attorney that afternoon, a man named Gerald Frost, who had handled Vincent's legal affairs for 18 years and who had a specific talent for receiving unusual instructions without making the person giving them feel they needed to justify themselves further than they already had. He called Gerald not because Marcus had done anything requiring legal response, but because Vincent had been considering for several months a revision to his estate documents that he had been postponing without knowing exactly why, and the morning had clarified something about the postponement. The revision he had been considering involved Marcus Webb, which was why he had postponed it. Because making a significant provision for an employee in one's will is the kind of decision that requires a specific kind of confidence about the person you are providing for, a confidence that Vincent had believed he had but had not been able to fully commit to until the 4 hours between 7:15 and 11 o'clock on a Tuesday in October had given him a demonstration that no conversation could have produced. He told his attorney what he intended to do. His attorney asked if he was certain. Vincent said he had been uncertain for 6 months and was now certain. His attorney said he would prepare the documents. Vincent did not tell Marcus what he had done. He did not tell him about the test either, which he had decided, in the hours after the phone call, was a thing he would carry rather than share, because sharing it would require Marcus to receive an apology for having been tested, and Vincent understood that some apologies cost the person receiving them more than they cost the person offering them, and that the appropriate response to having done something you regretted was sometimes to simply not repeat it rather than to unburden yourself of it onto the person you had wronged. What he did instead was change the texture of his attention to Marcus in the months that followed, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself or required acknowledgement or explanation, but in the specific small ways that become possible when you have stopped looking at someone through the distorting lens of a question you are trying to answer and have simply allowed yourself to see them as they are. He began, for the first time in 20 years, to actually talk to Marcus during the drives, not about logistics or schedules, but about other things. The way a man talks to a person he has decided to know rather than merely to employ. He found, across the following 2 years of these conversations, that Marcus Webb was a considerably more interesting person than Vincent had previously allowed himself to notice. He had grown up in Bridgeport, one of 4 children of a man who had worked maintenance for the city for 30 years, and had himself started working at 17 to help cover what his father's salary could not reach. He had been married for 22 years to a woman named Celestine, who taught 3rd grade at an elementary school on the north side of Hartford and who, according to Marcus, was the kind of person who noticed things about children that their own parents sometimes missed. The specific attentiveness of a woman who had chosen a difficult and undervalued job and approached it with more care than the job required of her. He had a son named James who was in his second year of a nursing program at the University of Connecticut, a choice James had made at 17 that Marcus had supported completely, and without the kind of subtle discouragement that some fathers directed towards sons who chose caregiving professions, rather than more conventionally lucrative ones. And James was paying for it largely through a combination of loans and work study and the money Marcus and Celestine had been setting aside since James was 12, a fund that Marcus described without self-consciousness as the primary savings project of their marriage, the thing they had organized the rest of their financial life around, which meant that every other financial decision they had made for 20 years had been made with that fund's health in mind. He had a daughter named Priya who was 15 and who had, apparently, a gift for mathematics that Marcus had recognized when she was 7 and that he had been quietly cultivating ever since through a combination of after-school programs and weekend math circles and a patient insistence that her talent was not incidental but central to who she was and what she could become. Vincent listened to all of this across 2 years of drives and found himself returning periodically to the 4 hours between 7:15 and 11 on a Tuesday in October, which he now understood differently than he had understood it in the immediate aftermath. He had looked at Marcus's behavior that morning and seen restraint, the not taking of something that could have been taken. What he understood now, knowing more of Marcus than he had then, was that restraint was the wrong frame, that a man who had spent 22 years organizing his marriage's savings around his sons' education did not put $400 from a rich man's backseat in his own pocket, not because he was restraining himself, but because it had simply not occurred to him as an option, because the map of the world he operated from did not include that particular road. This understanding was, Vincent reflected, both humbling and clarifying. He had staged a test to reveal a person's character, and the test had revealed his own. 3 years after the Tuesday in October, Vincent Hale had a heart attack, his second, the first having been a smaller warning 5 years earlier that had led to a change in diet and a twice-weekly cardiology visit, but apparently not to sufficient structural change in the underlying condition. He survived the second one, but the recovery was longer, and the doctors were more direct about what he needed to modify going forward. And in the weeks of recovery, Vincent spent considerable time with the specific quality of thought that arrives when a person has been reminded, concretely, that the time available is not infinite. He finalized the estate revisions during his recovery. They were what they had been for 3 years. The provision for Marcus that he had put in place after the phone call at 11, not a gesture in the direction of generosity, but a specific and considered amount, enough to pay off Marcus and Celestine's mortgage, enough to fully fund Priya's education at whatever school she chose, enough to represent a genuine transfer of security rather than a token of gratitude. When the estate was eventually settled, years later, it was Vincent's daughter Miriam who called Marcus. She had known, since her father's revision 3 years earlier, what the documents contained, and she had known why, because Vincent had told her, choosing to tell her in the specific interest of ensuring that the provision was understood as what it was, and not as something arbitrary or eccentric that his family might have reason to question. He had told her about the test, which he told her about with the specific candor of a man who understood he had not behaved well and was not interested in revising the story to make himself look better than he had been. He had told her about the phone call at 11. He had told her about the 2 years of conversations that had followed and what he had learned in them. Miriam had listened to all of this without interrupting, the way her father had always listened to things he wanted to understand rather than simply process. When he finished, she said that she was glad he had told her and that she understood why he had told her and why he had waited 3 years to do it, and that both of those things made sense to her. She said she was also glad, though she did not say this to him because she was not entirely sure he was ready to hear it, that Marcus had put the money in the console rather than calling at 7:15, because the call at 7:15 would have been the right answer to the wrong question, and what her father had needed was the answer to the right question, which was not whether Marcus was honest under scrutiny, but whether Marcus was simply Marcus, quietly and without performance. Whether the center console was where a person like Marcus put things he found in the back seat of a car, not because he was being watched, but because that was how he moved through the world. Marcus Webb received the call from Vincent Hale on a Thursday afternoon in November. A cold, clear day with the sky very blue in the way of late autumn New England days. The kind of day that looked warmer from inside a car than it actually was. He was between pickups, sitting in a parking lot near the hospital where Celestine's school had taken a field trip that day, waiting to drive her home because her car was in the shop and it was cold, and he had the afternoon free. And this was the kind of thing he did when he had the afternoon free, and there was a practical reason to do it. He listened to what Miriam told him. He asked her to repeat the figures, not because he had misheard, but because the numbers needed a second pass to become real. He sat in the parking lot for a while after the call ended. The car running, the hospital visible across the street. Celestine's class scheduled to emerge from the entrance at 3:30. He thought about Vincent Hale, who had died in February and whose funeral Marcus had attended, sitting in the back of the church in the same way he had always sat in the back of things, not making himself central to spaces where other people's relationships with the person being honored ran deeper than his own. He thought about 23 years of mornings. He thought about the center console and about a phone call he had made at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday in October. A phone call he had not thought about much since making it because it had seemed, at the time, like the ordinary kind of thing you did when you found money that was not yours in a car that was not yours. Not a demonstration of anything, but simply the handling of a small practical matter in the way that small practical matters got handled. He thought that this was perhaps the thing that made the most sense to him about what Miriam had told him, not the money, which was real and significant and would change specific things in specific ways that he would work out with Celestine over the coming days. But the reason behind it, the fact that Vincent Hale had apparently been paying the kind of attention to him that Marcus had never suspected and had drawn from 23 years of ordinary mornings, a conclusion about who Marcus was that Marcus had never thought to articulate about himself. He sat in the parking lot until 3:30, watching the hospital entrance and thinking about Vincent Hale and about 23 years, and about the specific and ordinary accumulation of mornings that constituted a life spent doing a job with care. And when Celestine's class came through the hospital entrance, her students around her in the chaotic and energetic way of third graders released from a structured activity, each of them bundled against the cold in a variety of coats and hats that had clearly been chosen by parents who ranged widely in their assessment of how cold it actually was. He got out of the car and waited by the entrance with his hands in his pockets. And when Celestine saw him across the parking lot, she raised her hand in the same small wave she had been giving him across 22 years. The wave that meant she had seen him and was glad he was there and would be with him in a moment. The wave that he had never once in 22 years grown tired of seeing. Now, before you go, I want to leave you with something that Marcus did not know for 3 years, which is that the phone call at 11 was the answer to a question he did not know he was being asked. He did not put the money in the console to demonstrate his integrity. He did not call at 11 to prove he was trustworthy. He simply did what he always did, which was handle things carefully and without fuss and in the way that made sense. And this turned out to be both the most ordinary thing in the world and the most revealing thing Vincent Hale had learned about another person in 40 years of building a business full of people. You are always answering questions you do not know are being asked. The way you drive when no one is watching. The way you handle something that did not belong to you. The way you wave at someone across a parking lot after 22 years. These are the answers. Tell me in the comments. Has someone ever trusted you in a way you only fully understood later? Tell me what that was. And if this story gave you something to carry, share it today with someone who needs to remember that character is what you are when the question has not been announced. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.